The U.S. Senate moves forward with a partial repeal of the NFA, plus a federal appeals court upholds gun-free school zones. All this and more on the news update.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the news update. I'm contributing writer Jake Fogleman, joined as always by Reload founder Stephen Gutowski. TheReload.com, of course, is where you can head on over today to sign up for our free weekly newsletter. It'll keep you up to date on all things happening in the world of gun politics and policy. Speaking of gun politics, obviously the big story of the week and of the last several weeks actually has been the development over what President Trump is calling his one big beautiful bill and the various gun provisions that gun rights groups have been fighting to get included. And we had a major update on that front in the Senate's version of this legislation, in which a pretty sweeping overhaul of the National Firearms Act and the various categories of weapons that are regulated by that act. You saw the Senate introduce far more sweeping language than what was even introduced in the House to essentially take out short-barreled rifles, shotguns, as well as silencers.
Yeah, and a category called any other weapon, which I guess I'll just try to explain briefly. It's a pretty confusing category just because it sounds like, every other gun is included. No, it's basically a category of like disguised firearms. So like umbrella guns or cane guns, things like that, as well as a couple other, firearms that are similar to some of the other regulated guns. But either way, this is what gun rights advocates were pushing for between the House and the Senate. There was skepticism from my sources that it was going to make it in there, but it did. So, the gun rights groups here have really been able to get the Republicans to do exactly what they want in this bill. They didn't start off with everything they had wanted, and they put on a very hard pressure campaign in public and behind the scenes to get a more complete NFA repeal effort. It's not a total repeal. You still have the machine guns and destructive devices in there, but everything else would be wiped out if the Senate language makes it into law. And so that's a pretty significant change. It's probably the most significant pro-gun legislation that you've seen in decades, since like the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act back in like 2005. So yeah, pretty big deal, the language that came out of the Senate Finance Committee this week. And as of now, some of the provisions are starting to go through the parliamentarian. We had a report from Semaphor's Burgess Everett before we jumped on here to that indicates a number of provisions have been struck out, but there wasn't any report on, no news on the NFA provisions yet. So right now it's very expansive, the language that's in the Senate bill, and its big hurdle is going to be whether or not it can make it through the parliamentarian. And so we're going to wait and see on that. But, a significant development, certainly. And one that also, I think we've talked about in the past why this is the best opportunity I think gun rights advocates have for getting some of this stuff through, silencer deregulation and essentially partial NFA repeal. There's really not a lot of other avenues that they're going to get that. It doesn't have 60 votes of support in the Senate at this point, and it's probably borderline whether it has majority support in the House if it were to go up as a standalone vote. So packaging it together in a must-pass bill like this with a lower threshold for passing the Senate, through reconciliation, you only need 50 votes instead of 50 plus a tiebreaker, instead of the 60 votes you would normally need. And so, that's the best opportunity. I think that gun rights advocates are going to have to do any of this probably for a while. If the midterms go like midterms normally go, or if the president's numbers continue to decline, it's likely that Democrats will recapture the House at least. The Senate's a harder hurdle there, but for the Democrats, but not completely out of reach necessarily. But either way, it's unlikely that you would get another chance like this. Probably not next year. I mean, there's not going to be a reconciliation bill like this next year. And so bottom line, it's the best shot they have, even if it's not guaranteed to work. Of course, we haven't talked that much about. We talked a lot about the vulnerabilities, right? And this text does add a couple more, as I wrote for members in a piece this morning. Which, by the way, we've had some issues with our email sender this morning, so I apologize if you got more than one copy of the email, or if you haven't gotten yours yet. We're working on that. You can always go to the reload.com. The newsletter is posted there as well. The full newsletter. So you can always use that as a backup. But regardless, the piece we published this morning, the members piece, I talked about how the text adds some issues on the short term. For instance, unlike the House version, which had essentially written out two separate sections that talked about, one would delist silencers and the other one would eliminate the tax on them. And so if the parliamentarians stripped out the delisting part, presumably you don't have to do anything necessarily to make sure to get the tax cut part through, is how I believe the process works. But with the new Senate language, they don't make that distinction. It just delists. It just cuts out a bunch of these devices from the definition of firearm under the National Firearms Act, effectively delisting them and making them not subject to the regulations, which does eliminate the tax. It says the same practical outcome. But if the parliamentarian says it doesn't work, you're going to lose the whole section instead of just the delisting. And now there is as we interviewed Knox Williams from the American Suppressor Association last week, or I guess, last week on the show. And he, I spoke to him about this, and he said there's a backup plan for this among gun rights activists, where essentially they'd have a Republican offer up an amendment that would just be the tax portion of the reform instead, if this parliamentarian eliminates delisting. So there is a backup plan now. And, as I said, gun rights advocates have been pretty good at getting the Republicans to do what they want throughout this process. So I don't think it's a huge risk, but there is some risk that if it gets stripped out, especially because Republicans are trying to move really fast in this whole thing, they want to pass the whole thing by the 4th of July. And so if your provision falls out of a giant bill like this, I don't think there's a guarantee that you can get another version of it back in before they go to a final vote. We'll see. Same issue with the language for the section that tries to address one of the issues that Senator Lummis from Wyoming had with the bill, which is there are these state NFA mirror laws that criminalize the possession of silencers and short barrel rifles and shotguns unless you have that federal tax stamp, essentially. Now, there's some dispute, as Knox said on the show last week, over the interpretation of the language of some of these state laws and how much whether they would actually criminalize possession if you delisted these things from the NFA. But there is an attempt in this text to moot the problem, to say essentially, well, if a state law requires you to have federal permission to own these items, this text stands as that federal permission, essentially. So But the problem is it only applies to short barrel shotguns, rifles, and any other weapons at this point. They need to add in silencers because it just didn't get added in the drafting process for whatever reason. There's some sloppy work there. Legislators' part, but they're supposedly going to fix that as well in the manager's amendment. So we'll see. But those are the sort of short-term problems that this text introduces. The other issue are long-term issues. If this all succeeds, right, or even if just the tax cut succeeds in getting through, well, you've established a precedent that you can manipulate the National Firearms Act through reconciliation. And so the next time a Democrat is in office and has control of Congress, which may not be very long, that we've been going back and forth here for one off, one on the last couple of cycles. So the issue is that they could do the exact same thing. They could raise the tax on NFA items. I think a lot of Democrats probably believe that, one of the interesting aspects of the National Firearms Act is that the tax was not pinned to inflation. It was just a straight tax, $200, which is why it's not as much of a burden today for people to actually legally own NFA items. And so I think there's probably an appetite among Democrats to increase the tax if they got back in control of this process, which we've already seen a Democrat suggest this during the House markup of the bill. They said, well, we should triple it to $600 so we can, with the explicit intent of trying to prevent people from buying these items, which was frankly the goal of the NFA in the first place. But so you might see that happen in a couple of years. And then additionally, if you can delist items from the NFA through reconciliation, well, that implies you could add items to the NFA through reconciliation. And this is another area where we've already seen prominent Democrats argue for adding so-called assault weapons, primarily AR-15s and similar firearms, to the NFA. This was actually one of the primary planks of the Biden 2020 campaign on guns. They wanted to do a buyback scheme where you either had to sell back your assault weapons, your ARs, or you had to register them with the NFA. Or under the NFA. So, if you can delist silencers and short barrel rifles and shotguns from the NFA through reconciliation, well, you can probably add them back and add more in the future as well. Certainly there would be political and legal fights over all of that, of course, as there are right now over this attempt. But if it works, that's the big drawback in the long run, is that's something to understand about this whole process. Now, look, I think that's something gun rights advocates involved in this fight understand, and all of the gun rights groups are on the same page on this. So I think they've made the calculation that have that fight down the line or worry about those things when they come, and try to use the influence you have now to accomplish, these long running goals. But that's the risk. If you go majoritarian on repealing certain aspects of federal gun law, you're setting a precedent that the other side can go majoritarian on enacting new restrictions, which is something that you've seen gun control activists call for in the past. They've called to eliminate the filibuster to pass an assault weapons ban. Now Democrats haven't been willing to do that. But this is a even easier way to get that accomplished. If Republicans are going to do it through reconciliation and they are able to accomplish it, at least surrounding this one bill, right? The NFA is different from other gun laws. It's different from the traditional assault weapons ban in that it's a tax and not a ban. But that's the long-term risk. It may be worth getting this this through, right? And this is something we've talked about, reconciliation in the NFA, for a long time before this became a proposal in Congress. Like it's understandable why somebody would want to go this route. It is the best chance, but it does come with these potential drawbacks.
Yeah, absolutely. It is an interesting wrinkle to see the NFA become more of a high salience issue for folks perhaps on the other side of the aisle now that gun rights advocates and Republicans have raised it as a potential political vehicle for enacting pretty sweeping gun policy change, rather. Yeah. Like you said, should the Senate parliamentarian bless this, which is still a big if, like you said, we should know a little bit more. Apparently, according to reporting from Politico, both parties, members of both parties in the Senate, are supposed to make some presentations to the parliamentarian over the weekend and start making their own recommendations of what they would like to see reviewed. And those rulings evidently are going to start coming out in earnest next week. So we'll know more, hopefully then. But should that be the case, you've already seen, as you mentioned, that one, at least House member talk about, I just realized that this tax hasn't been raised since it was passed. This clearly should be higher, something that was never on the political radar until this became an issue. And if the strategy gets blessed going forward, I could very easily see this becoming the new gun policy political football.
Yeah. I mean, I don't see how it wouldn't. I mean, the only way it doesn't is like silencers reach a certain critical mass of popularity to where they, Democrats just can't muster majority support to put something like this in a reconciliation bill. But I think that's very unlikely because AR-15s are the most popular rifle in the country, and they are still also firearms that where you see a lot of support for banning them, especially among Democrats. So I just don't see how, it's a bit of opening of Pandora's box here, but I mean, now that the idea is already out there, you probably see it tried anyway, regardless. Yeah. But that's something to keep in mind down the road is like the tactics that you use today can just as easily be used against you when the other side has control. And it's not necessarily to say that you shouldn't try to do it. But it's something to understand.
Yeah, absolutely. But we'll, of course, stay on top of this fight as it develops. Like you said, we should get some more details in the coming days because the President Trump has been pushing his party to get moving on this thing. And there's only a couple of weeks until July 4th. So we will see where this all pans out. Moving beyond the halls of Congress, we have a ruling that we want to briefly touch on because I think you're going to get a little more in depth on our interview podcast this weekend. Yes. We had the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals issue a big ruling on the Federal Gun-Free School Zones Act. Sorry, kind of a mouthful. Where a 3-judge panel unanimously said that the law is constitutional, at least as it applies to a particular man that was charged and convicted for violating the act.
Yeah, and you wrote up a piece on this, but I believe this is one of the first times we've seen that federal law challenged under the Bruin standard. It's a Second Amendment challenge here. So, but the details are a bit odd, or at least a bit, not that that's unusual. There's a lot of legal cases where the details are strange. This one dealt with a guy who was from New York. He drove through Pennsylvania where he bought an AR-15, which I'm kind of surprised they let him buy an AR-15 in Pennsylvania if he's from New York. But you can do interstate sales, certainly, of rifles and shotguns. But I don't know, a lot of places won't let you buy a gun you can't legally own back where you're from. So I don't know. Be interested in how that happened. But either way, he didn't go back to New York regardless. He went to Texas, where you can legally possess, of course, AR-15s. And he just kind of stopped at this random town in Texas and by this private Catholic school and set up camp for weeks on end, it sounds like, which made, perhaps understandably, the community there, especially the parents of the kids at the school, uncomfortable. And they started to become concerned about his presence. And I guess he made some cryptic remarks to a parent or a school member who then reported that to the police, who arrested him and searched his car. And they found not just the AR-15, but also like videos of him torturing animals was part of this, right? And
yep.
And I think he had wasn't there something about wanting to kill President Biden as well? Written threats against President Biden, just deeply unnerving things found in the car. And so they charged him with violating this federal gun-free zone act that puts a gun-free zone 1,000 feet around every school. And so he challenged that on the basis that it violated his Second Amendment rights and lost, right?
Yeah, that's right. They actually subjected it to the full, Bruin test. And kind of funny enough, this is a law that came up actually in Bruin. They upheld it basically largely on the so-called Statute of Northampton, which is a statute. It was referred to as Fray laws in Rahimi. It's basically a long tradition in English common law of prohibiting people from carrying weapons in such a manner that terrifies the people.
So they said that he's like terrifying this community with his by parking his car in there with his gun and making cryptic remarks. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting, the level of when they searched his car, they obviously found even more concerning stuff. But before that, what rises to the level of his actions terrifying people is, I guess, will be an open question. But the court in this case said yes, the things he was doing, especially by being armed, similar in nature to what they were trying to prevent with these affray laws back in the founding era.
That's right. Yeah.
Which is kind of interesting that they went that direction instead of just doing the sensitive places analysis.
Yeah, and that even came up in the ruling where they mentioned that there's some dispute over sensitive places, and the judge basically that wrote the opinion said, we're just not going to get into this here until the court gives us some more guidance on that. We think we're close enough with this historical analog approach. And they did that pretty frankly, they did that throughout this opinion where the majority author emphasized that, hey, we're not opining at all on the Gun-Free School Zones Act being applied in other instances. We just think that this specific application, the specific fact pattern of this odd guy happens to be one instance in which it actually can be applied constitutionally. This was an as-applied only challenge. So I guess there's still, the potential for other as-applied versions to not pass constitutional muster. But in this case, it was just for this particular defendant and the way he was behaving with his AR-15 near the school.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, it leaves open the door for other challenges. I mean, most people, the objections you usually hear to this law involve people who are licensed to carry not being able to carry on school grounds because of this. Excuse me. I think we're both, having trouble speaking this morning. But yes, so, it is interesting to see them fall back on affray laws or going arms laws instead of the sensitive places laws. Because even the Supreme Court, I believe, called out schools as a proper sensitive place in Bruin. So I don't know. It's strange to see them go that direction. That's something that we talk about or I talk about with Charles Cook from National Review at length on the interview podcast that's coming out on Sunday for members and Monday for everybody else. But that, you'd think they'd have a better case with the sensitive places argument, but Charles has a different objection actually to this whole outcome because the Gun-Free School Zones Act is justified on Commerce Clause grounds, which has been, I think, something you've seen conservative legal scholars complain about the breadth of that power or how it's been interpreted since the progressive era, since the New Deal, and so Charles has actually an objection based on that.
I would say it was actually struck down by the Supreme Court at one point on those grounds before Congress re-amended it to try to beef up their Commerce Clause argument in the mid-90s. Yeah.
But we'll get into the details of that with Charles on the show because he has more to say about that whole situation in the history there. But and we also talk a bit about the Senate bill and some of the ideas and concerns that it raises as well. So I think it's a really good episode, and it'll be out again for members on Sunday and Monday for everybody else. So make sure you go over to thereload.com and buy a membership if you haven't already. That's how we do all of this. And times are tight for everyone, I understand, but that's the only way we can operate. So anyway, what's our next story? We had another one, right?
That's right. We had a little bit of an update on the DOJ and how active it's been in sort of Second Amendment litigation around the country. They just filed an amicus brief in the Seventh Circuit in the legal fight over Illinois. This is the big consolidated legal challenge over Illinois' state so-called assault weapon ban, as well as some of the local assault weapon bans. And the DOJ actually intervened in this case to file a brief and say that they believe that Illinois' ban violates the Second Amendment.
Yeah, so obviously a change of course for DOJ from the previous DOJ.
Yeah.
And I don't know that it's going to have any impact in this case. We already seen what the panel thinks of the legal questions here. And I don't, the DOJ's arguments aren't anything, new necessarily. They're your common use arguments that you've seen before in these types of cases that the court rejected the first time around. In this case. And so, but, it is more of a political story. I guess this shift in the DOJ's position, brought on by President Trump, his executive order telling the DOJ to reconsider its positions on Second Amendment cases. This seems to be the outcome of that effort. And it's, significant in the sense that now the government is on the side of the gun rights activists in these cases instead of the other way around. So, but, it also speaks, I think, a bit to the piece you wrote last week on how, DOJ has been happy to apply a very broad reading of the Second Amendment to a lot of state laws, like this one in Illinois, but maybe not as eager to do it on federal law, right? So another example of that, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that's the big story here. It's just another data point in the broader story that we've been following here is what the DOJ is going to do with President Trump's directive for it to be more active on Second Amendment cases. And like you mentioned, I wrote a piece last week, and I think this just is in line with that, where they're more than happy to weigh in when blue states are
especially
passing laws, especially blue states. They love to be antagonistic to those blue states.
A lot of the Trump 2 administration's actions are just explicitly about going after Democrat-controlled states.
Right.
And so this seems also another prong of that effort as well. So,
right.
But it's certainly something I'm sure gun rights advocates will be pleased to see from the DOJ. And something I would expect more of these briefs. I mean, again, I don't know how much it's going to matter. I don't know if it has how much weight this all has. They've gotten involved in a number of cases in this way. I mean, this is more a traditional amicus brief. So the DOJ does that, in cases that it thinks are sort of connected to what it's otherwise doing. Yep. This is a little bit outside of that, maybe sort of little adventurism. They're just going out and talking about their commitment to the Second Amendment, which, again, symbolic, but something that I'm sure gun rights advocates appreciate. You've seen them, you saw them do this with something even more aggressive than this with that case out of California, where they got involved to ask the Supreme Court to take up a case that they're not even a party to. That was so, they've been doing this. They've been going around, and I don't know how much of an effect it has, I guess, is the bottom line. This is sort of a more symbolic than anything. But, sometimes certainly the DOJ tends to have influence in the federal court system. But I don't know. We'll see we'll have to see if it makes any difference one way or the other when in these cases where they're not directly a party.
Especially this panel, if listeners will recall, this is the panel that said that AR-15s can be banned because they're almost identical to M16s. And
right,
the Supreme Court said in Heller that M16s can be banned. So ipso facto, AR-15s can be banned too. So it seems like a panel that's pretty motivated to uphold these kinds of laws, whether or not Trump's DOJ says they shouldn't.
Yeah, I just don't see it having real world impact. This is like a symbolic gesture, which is fine, right? It's not a bad thing. It's just, don't get too excited about it, I guess.
Yeah, certainly.
The impact it might have. But yeah, we
getting
got
into
some
of
good,
our
links, right?
Getting into some of our newsletter links. Interesting. We have a development, local media out of Utah. Development over this sort of wild story that happened actually last weekend in light of the big nationwide No Kings protests in Salt Lake City. We had a pretty tragic incident in which, evidently, as the demonstration was going on, one person present at the demonstration at one point pulled out an AR-15.
Or was carrying it,
or was carrying it, and two designated peacekeepers is what they're being referred to in media reports, and I believe the police reports as well, were armed, and they pulled out their sidearms, confronted this person who, according to the peacekeepers, they say he then put the AR-15 into a firing position and began moving towards the crowd. So they fired shots, striking this man once, but also tragically striking a just innocent bystander fatally. And so we now have sort of the aftermath of trying to put together what happened, and we're getting some new details.
Right. And the police have gone with that account initially. And the guy who was shot in this exchange, the guy who was carrying the AR-15, he's in prison on charges over this. But now we're getting, as you mentioned, more details. And there's a lot of questions being raised about that particular narrative, whether this guy was actually some sort of threat. Apparently, he's a local activist who open carries at demonstrations on a regular basis, or at least has open carried at demonstrations in the past. I think he's politically aligned with the No Kings movement, or at least the goals. He's more on the left of the political spectrum. So he's not necessarily somebody who's shown a motive to want to attack these people who were out there protesting. And there is a video that has come out, and that's what we linked to, is this local news report that shows, it's fairly far away footage, but it does appear to show in the cropped in version that at least at the time the shots were fired, the guy with the AR-15 was not pointing it at anyone. He was looked to be in low ready, carrying it as you would if you were just carrying a rifle without trying to threaten someone with it. So that's where there's new questions being raised about, who actually is in the wrong here, or, whether it was appropriate to shoot this guy and then obviously in the process of shooting him, to kill someone else. It does, and this might sound strange at first, but it reminds me a lot of the Rittenhouse shooting, and sort of the dangers of carrying at events like this, whether protests or, obviously Rittenhouse situation was a little bit different because it wasn't a protest he was at like a riot, essentially, trying to provide. And he went in, it appears, thinking that he was there to try and provide security and help protect property. And I think he went in, as a lot of people do, with the assumption, like in this case, that just sort of having a gun is going to make people, behave properly around you and not do anything. And in both these cases, you see at an event where you have two armed people, who from their perspectives are like doing the right thing or protecting the community or what have you. Because obviously the Rittenhouse situation started with somebody charging him. And that's how the first shooting occurred. But then when he ran away from that one, he encountered a bunch of other people who I think didn't know what was really going on and thought that he had, murdered somebody and were trying to stop him from leaving. And that's when you got into the second incident where there was somebody with a handgun and who raises it to point at Rittenhouse and then gets shot in the process for that. All, like, as the jury concluded, acts of self-defense, like maybe borderline, but they were self-defense acts. And I think if the guy with the handgun in the Rittenhouse situation had shot Rittenhouse first instead of the other way around, he probably would have had a good case for self-defense as well. And it just, in this case, it appears like you have two people who went to this event thinking they were going to be there to provide community security, right? The peacekeeper people, I don't know if they were hired by the protest organizers. It sounds more like they were volunteer peacekeepers. And you see that sometimes at protests like this, right? And, I think this just reveals the high level of uncertainty and danger that can come around when you take it upon yourself to try and provide security for big events or groups. And this is the kind of thing that can happen, is sort of confusion around someone walking down the street with an AR-15 in Utah is not illegal and is not inherently threatening. But if you're there providing security and you're thinking, if you don't have the proper state of mind doing that, you might think somebody walking towards the crowd with a gun is automatically a threat and shoot them. Like, you can see how this would go. Or perhaps he did raise the gun before that video starts. It's hard to determine, but from what it sounds like, is this was a shooting that was born out of confusion, not out of an actual threat. And the guy going there with his AR-15, thinking he was going to be providing community service and defense, thinking nobody's, if I'm just open carrying, I've done it a lot before, that's the issue you can get into, is that people can misunderstand what's going on, and it becomes a deadly threat situation. So I don't know. That's just what it reminded me of, was the Rittenhouse shooting, between at least the part where he shot the other guy who was also armed at that parade. I don't remember if the second guy who was armed in the Rittenhouse situation was legally armed or not. It sounds like both of these guys were legally armed, and there was just a horrible misunderstanding which led to somebody being killed. Now, I assume we'll get more details on this as it unfolds, but it's just a reminder of the seriousness with which you have to take carrying a firearm, especially at a event with a lot of people. I mean, this is what can happen. And it's something that is under discussed, I think, in these scenarios, the sort of responsibility that comes along with doing it. Because both these guys seem like, up until the point the shots were fired, they're probably within their legal rights to carry their guns. And the details we have now, it sounds like this was a misunderstanding that led to a third person, not even involved, not even one of the people carrying the gun, being killed. So, I mean, I don't know. Obviously, if the guy with the AR was not a threat, if he hadn't made any threatening movements prior to being shot, then the peacekeeper guy, this volunteer, is the one in the wrong ultimately. But I just think it speaks to the nature of how carrying guns in public, especially at protests or during riots, is much more serious than a lot of people will make it out to be. Like, you mostly hear the why this is a good idea. And I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I'm just saying that it comes with many more chaotic possibilities than most people consider, I think, when they go out to do this. So it's just something to keep in mind. But anyway, that's an important case too, to just make sure we get a full understanding of what actually happened. Was this person trying to threaten the event, or did this peacekeeper make the wrong decision and shoot an innocent person who was legally exercising their rights? We don't know for sure yet, but the new details are certainly complicating the initial report, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the other last story we want to touch on before we wrap up here comes to us from the New York Times, talking about a new bit of detail coming out from the president's preferred budget for the ATF. This is obviously something we've been following for weeks now, that what exactly is going to become of the agency. And evidently, they're envisioning cutting up to 2/3 of the staff dedicated to overseeing and regulating the firearms industry as part of a way to slash a big part of the agency's budget.
Yeah, the IOIs, they call them, are a big target of this proposed budget. They want to cut about $500 million from the ATF's budget, and they actually also want to combine the ATF with the DEA, which is proven to be a more controversial proposal than the budget cut itself. The budget cut I think is going to raise a lot of criticism from gun control activists, certainly, because essentially they're trying to save money at the ATF by just slashing by 40% the number of people overseeing the firearms industry, which was already a long-term complaint from gun control activists and Democrats, that they just don't do a lot of inspections of gun dealers, and that they don't revoke licenses a lot. That's why you saw during the Biden administration, they tried to ramp up the number of inspections and license revocations, which they succeeded in doing that. But so the Trump administration is obviously going the opposite direction here, and significantly cutting those efforts. But the bigger vision, I guess, is to try and consolidate some of these federal law enforcement agencies, primarily the ATF, by combining with the DEA, which is a much larger organization, and which gun rights pretty much everyone I've seen discuss this is against the idea, at least within the gun world. I've talked to ATF sources, and they're all against this idea. You've seen the industry, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, is against this idea. The gun rights groups, GOA, has come out very adamantly against the idea of combining ATF with DEA. As somebody in the administration thinks it's a good idea, I guess probably your Doge, your efficiency advocates, if you want to call them that, in the agent, can see maybe some cost savings by combining the two agencies. That certainly seems to be the idea, which is not a new idea. That goes back to actually the Clinton administration had a proposal like this. It's been floating around for decades now, but this is, I don't know if this is the first time it's been included in the president's budget, but certainly the first time recently. And a lot of the cost savings would come from cutting industry oversight, but also, they want to cut, it appears, things like e-form consolidation, which is something the ATF has actually exceeded at recent years, and getting some of those processing times down. And the only area that you see in this budget that has an increase in funding comes with this new rights restoration process that they want to undertake. But that has a caveat too, right? Yeah.
So they want about $500,000 to go to this, but it doesn't include any. It's not a ton of money, and it doesn't include any staffing, any employers to oversee this. So, and the language that's included in that request seems to suggest, anyway, some sort of automated process to that money's going to be going to. It talks about
an automated process for sure. It makes me feel like it's going to be some sort of AI bot thing, because that's what the Trump administration has been increasingly pushing towards, AI for a lot of government tasks. And I don't know how you're going to process many people through a rights restoration process if you're only allocating $500,000 a year to it, and you don't allocate any staff towards it. The description that they put out sounds like they're trying to make it an automated. We talked about this back when they first came out, and there was that dispute where they fired the pardon attorney over the Mel Gibson rights restoration. And one of the other disputes she had with DOJ leadership before she was fired was over whether this process should be on a case-by-case basis or more automated. So, I guess the idea here is if you make it automated, people just have to check certain number of boxes in terms of their record or their conduct since they were convicted. That's the only way you could possibly get to a process that has any real reach while having no funding or staff assigned to it. And even then, I think I'd be skeptical of how well it works. I don't know if anyone has ever interacted with the government before, but generally speaking, they're not very good at processing a lot of information quickly and efficiently. So, I don't know. It's movement, right? That we hadn't seen any plan before this, any like detailed plan, and so now there's an actual proposal out there. It's just I don't know if this is what. If you were hoping for a robust rights restoration process, I don't know that that's what we're seeing with this proposal. $500,000 and no staff, and discussion of some sort of automated system. I don't know. It's not a promising start, but we'll see. We'll see where it goes. And also, there's no guarantee that any of this makes it into into actual practice. That's the thing about president's proposed budget is usually the president doesn't get most of what he asked for. Now, this president and this Congress, this party, it's a lot more captured by the president than even the last time he was president. So maybe there'll be more. They're kind of more subservient this time around, I would say, most Republican lawmakers to Donald Trump. So maybe he has a better batting percentage on these requests than previous presidents have had. But we'll see.
Yeah, it's definitely an important caveat. Like you said, it's not super promising on the rights restoration front, but you never know with this president and this administration what's going to happen in the end.
Yeah. But that's all we've got for this week. You got anything fun coming up? I mean, you did your bachelor trip right out to Nashville.
That's right. Yep. Last weekend. Yep. Had a good time out there. Got to shoot some guns, full auto machine guns.
Look at that. How was it?
It was really fun. Shot a suppressed MP5, which was really cool. Shot an M240, which was awesome. And then I got to shoot 50 BMG the first time I shot a 50 BMG Barrett.
That's an experience, right?
And it was suppressed, which was crazy. They put a giant suppressor on this 50 BMG Barrett, and the gas blowback was insane on that thing. But it was fun. It was a great time.
No, that's awesome. Yeah, no, glad to see you had a good time and you got to experience full auto for the first time. I think people should get out there and give it a try if they have the opportunity. I think it's more and more common now that ranges will have a full auto rental. So, make sure that your range has good range safety officers that are overseeing the whole thing. But that's usually how they do it. As I mentioned, I think the last time we talked about this, it's unintuitively, it's actually a pretty good way for beginners to start because you get way more one-on-one hands-on supervision in those situations than you do in just a regular gun range with regular semi-automatic firearms. So anyway, I'm glad that you got to experience it and have some fun and that you're back here and we got this podcast out to folks. Again, apologies for the email issues we had this morning. Hopefully we will have that resolved shortly, but you can always go to thereload.com and check out the newsletters there. They're always posted there. In addition to being sent to your mailbox every Friday and Sunday if you are a Reload member. But that's all we've got for you guys this week. We will see you again real soon.